The great kitchen of Downton Abbey never stopped. Pots were always boiling, bread was always rising, and somewhere in the middle of it all stood Mrs. Patmore, the heart of the whole operation. She had cooked for lords and ladies, survived impossible dinner parties, and kept every meal running like clockwork for years, but something had changed. The recipes she once knew by heart were now giving her trouble. The labels on the jars looked blurry. The measurements felt uncertain. And yet she said nothing, because admitting that something was wrong was not something Mrs. Patmore did easily. She had spent her whole life being the strong one, the dependable one, the one who never needed help. So she kept squinting, kept guessing, and kept hoping nobody would notice. But in a house like Downton Abbey, nothing stays hidden for long. It started with small things. A pinch too much salt in the soup. A sauce that came out thicker than it should have been. A pudding that was slightly overdone around the edges. On their own, these mistakes meant nothing. Every cook had an off day. But when it happened again, and then again after that, people began to pay attention. Daisy was the first one to notice. She had worked beside Mrs. Patmore long enough to know her rhythms, her habits, and her standards. Mrs. Patmore did not make careless mistakes. She was precise. She was careful. She took pride in every single dish that left her kitchen. So when Daisy watched her lean in close to read a handwritten recipe card, tilting it toward the light and squinting hard, she felt a quiet worry settle in her chest. She did not say anything right away. She just watched and kept the thought to herself. A few days later, Mrs. Hughes came down to the kitchen to go over the menu for an upcoming dinner. It was a routine conversation, the kind they had shared dozens of times before. But as Mrs. Patmore picked up the menu card and held it at arm's length, then brought it closer, then tilted her head to one side, Mrs. Hughes noticed something was not right. She did not make a comment in that moment. She was far too sensible for that. Instead, she quietly filed it away in her mind, the way she filed away everything that needed to be handled carefully. That evening, after the kitchen had quieted down, and the staff had gathered for their supper, Carson mentioned that the sauce at dinner had been slightly off. He said it in his usual manner, straightforward and without cruelty, simply noting it as a fact. The table went a little quiet. Mrs. Patmore straightened in her chair and said that the sauce had been perfectly fine, and that perhaps his palate was the problem, not her cooking. A few people smiled into their plates, but underneath her sharp reply, there was something else. A flicker of something that looked very much like worry. Mrs. Hughes had a way of handling difficult people. She did not push. She did not argue. She simply waited for the right moment, chose her words with care, and said exactly what needed to be said. And when it came to Mrs. Patmore, she knew that moment had to be chosen very wisely indeed. She found her one quiet afternoon, just after the lunch service had ended and the kitchen had emptied out. The pots had been scrubbed, the surfaces wiped clean, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Patmore was sitting at the kitchen table with a recipe card in her hand, holding it close to her face, then further away, then close again. She did not hear Mrs. Hughes come in. She was too focused on whatever battle she was having with those small, stubborn words on the page. Mrs. Hughes sat down across from her without making a fuss about it. She folded her hands on the table and spoke in the calm, even tone she used when something important needed to be said but did not need to become a scene. She told Mrs. Patmore that she had noticed a few things lately, that the kitchen did not seem to be running the way it usually did, that mistakes were happening that did not used to happen, and that she was not saying any of this to cause trouble, but because she genuinely cared about her. Mrs. Patmore put the recipe card down slowly. There was a long pause. Then she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound unbothered, that she had no idea what Mrs. Hughes was talking about. Her kitchen was running just fine. It had always run just fine. And if a sauce was slightly thick one evening, that was hardly reason to sit a woman down and treat her like she was falling apart. Mrs. Hughes did not flinch. She had expected this. She let the words settle, gave Mrs. Patmore a moment to feel. heard, and then gently continued. She said that nobody was suggesting she was falling apart. Quite the opposite. She said that a woman who had given as much as Mrs. Patmore had given to Downton Abbey deserved to have someone look out for her. Even when she was too proud to look out for herself, that landed differently. Mrs. Patmore opened her mouth, then closed it again. Something shifted behind her eyes, just slightly, just for a second. It was not agreement. Not yet. But it was a crack in the wall, and Mrs. Hughes had been around long enough to know that a crack was all you needed. The conversation did not end. In a resolution that afternoon, Mrs. Patmore stood up, straightened her apron, and announced that she had preparations to get on with. But as she moved back toward the stove, she paused just briefly near the shelf where the spice jars were lined up in a row. She reached for one, then stopped, squinted at the label, reached for a different one. And then quietly, without turning around, she carried on with her work as if nothing had happened at all. Mrs. Hughes watched her go. She did not say another word. She simply rose from the table, smoothed her dress, and walked back toward the door. But before she left, she glanced back one more time at the woman standing at that stove, the woman who had fed an entire household for decades without complaint. And she made a private decision that something was going to be done about this. Whether Mrs. Patmore liked it or not, nobody told Mrs. Patmore directly that the appointment had been made. That would have been a mistake. If she had been given advance notice, she would have found 12 different reasons why that particular day was impossible, why the kitchen could not survive without her for even a few hours, and why the whole idea was unnecessary in the first place. So Mrs. Hughes did what any sensible person would do when dealing with a proud and stubborn woman. She simply arranged everything quietly, told Mrs. Patmore the morning of, and made it very clear that the matter was already settled. Mrs. Patmore stood in the middle of the kitchen with her apron still on, and stared at Mrs. Hughes as if she had just been told to swim across the channel. She said she had a stock to prepare. She said the afternoon bread had not been started. She said that Daisy was not yet ready to handle things on her own, and that leaving the kitchen in her hands for an entire afternoon was practically inviting disaster. Mrs. Hughes listened to every single word with a patient expression and then told her that Daisy would manage perfectly well, that the bread could wait, and that the car had already been arranged. There was a silence in which Mrs. Patmore seemed to be searching for one more argument strong enough to end the conversation. She did not find one. And so, with all the enthusiasm of a woman being led to her own trial, she untied her apron, handed it to Daisy without a word, and went upstairs to put on her coat. The drive into town was quiet. Mrs. Patmore sat in the back with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the passing countryside. The fields rolled by, the trees lined the road in long soft rows, and the morning light sat low and pale over the whole landscape. It was the kind of scenery that usually settled a person. But Mrs. Patmore did not look settled. She looked like a woman preparing herself for something she did not want to face. It was not the doctor she was afraid of. She had faced enough hard things in her life to know that a medical appointment was hardly the worst of them. What she was afraid of was what the appointment might confirm. Because as long as nobody had said it out loud, as long as there was no official word, she could still tell herself that nothing was really wrong. She could still believe that she was the same Mrs. Patmore she had always been. Sharp, capable, unshakable. The moment a doctor put a name to it, that story would be harder to hold on to. The town came into view gradually, rooftops appearing first above the tree line, then chimneys, then the familiar shapes of the high street buildings. The car slowed as it moved through the narrow roads and came to a stop outside a quiet building with a clean, painted sign beside the door. Mrs. Patmore looked at that sign for a long moment without moving. Then she drew herself up, lifted her chin slightly in that particular way she had when she was facing something she did not like but had decided to face anyway, and reached for the door handle. She stepped out onto the pavement and stood for just a second in the cool open air. Around her, the town went about its ordinary business, people passing with baskets and bags, a cart moving slowly down the road. Somewhere nearby, the sound of a shop door opening and closing. Nobody paid her any attention. Nobody knew what this small, quietly determined woman was about to walk into, or how much it had cost her just to get this far. She straightened her coat, took one steady breath, and walked through the door. The ride back to Downton was different from the ride into town. It was not louder or more cheerful in any obvious way. Mrs. Patmore still sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes turned toward the window. But something about the quality of her silence had changed. It was no longer the tight, braced silence of a woman dreading what was coming. It was softer than that, quieter in a way that felt more like thinking than worrying. The doctor had been straightforward with her, and she had appreciated that more than she expected to. He had not talked down to her or treated her like someone fragile. He had simply examined her eyes with calm efficiency, told her what he found, explained what it meant, and shown her a selection of spectacles that would correct the problem. The diagnosis was not dramatic. It was not the kind of news that changed everything. It was simply the natural result of years of close work in a kitchen, of reading handwritten recipe cards in low light, of squinting at labels and measurements day after day for more years than she cared to count. Her eyes had grown tired. That was all. And tired eyes, the doctor said, could be helped. She had chosen a pair of spectacles that she privately thought were not entirely unbecoming. She would never have admitted that out loud, of course. But she had glanced at herself in the small mirror the doctor held up, and the thought had crossed her mind before she could stop it. She had put them in her coat pocket for the journey home, not quite ready to wear them in the open air where anyone passing might see. That felt like a step to be taken on her own terms. The gates of Downton came into view and the car turned up. The long, familiar drive. The house rose ahead of her the way it always did, steady and solid and unchanged, and she felt the particular comfort of returning to a place that knew her. Whatever had shifted inside her that afternoon, this was still her kitchen. These were still her people. And she still had work to do. Daisy had clearly been watching for her. The moment Mrs. Patmore came through the door, she was there, trying to look casual and failing completely. She asked how it had gone in a voice that was working very hard to sound like the answer did. Not matter much. Mrs. Patmore set her bag down, hung up her coat, and without making any kind of ceremony of it, reached into her pocket and put the spectacles on. The kitchen went very still for just a moment. Daisy stared. One of the other kitchen maids found something very important to look at. On the other side of the room, Mrs. Patmore stood there and looked around the kitchen through her new spectacles, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, everything was sharp and clear and exactly where it was supposed to be. The labels on the jars were readable. The recipe cards were readable. The hands on the clock were readable. The whole kitchen, her kitchen, came back into focus like a picture being properly framed for the first time. She moved to her workstation without fanfare, picked up the menu card that was sitting there waiting for her, and read it cleanly from top to bottom without tilting it or squinting or holding it at an awkward angle. Then she set it down, rolled up her sleeves, and told Daisy to stop standing there with her mouth open and start on the vegetables, because dinner was not going to cook itself. Daisy smiled so wide she had to turn away to hide it. Mrs. Hughes appeared in the doorway a little later, drawn perhaps by some quiet instinct that things had shifted. She looked at Mrs. Patmore moving through the kitchen with her usual authority, the spectacles sitting neatly on her face, and she allowed herself a small private smile that she kept entirely to herself. She did not make a comment. She did not need to. The kitchen sounded the way it was supposed to sound again. The rhythm was back. The confidence is back. And the woman at the center of it all was exactly who she had always been. Just a little more clearly herself than she had been that morning. Because that was the thing about Mrs. Patmore. She had not been made smaller by needing help. She had not been diminished by admitting that something had to change. If anything, walking through that door in town, sitting in that chair, and letting someone tell her the truth had taken more strength than most people would ever know. The pride was still there. The sharpness was still there. The absolute refusal To let a single dish leave her kitchen below standard was very much still there. But now there was also something else. A quiet, settled kind of peace that comes to a person when they stop fighting something they cannot change and simply deal with it. Downton Abbey had seen generations come and go. It had weathered seasons and change and the long, slow turning of time. And through much of it, somewhere below stairs, a woman had stood at a stove and fed them all. That woman was still there, still standing, still cooking. And now at last she could see every single thing she was doing.